Nobody warned the human who the ragged alien woman really was. He shared his bread anyway. Who was the ragged alien woman really? And why did the human choose to share his bread without knowing the truth? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are excited to have you here for another unforgettable HFY science fiction story filled with heart and humanity. If you enjoy inspiring adventures like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for your incredible support, for watching, and for being part of this amazing community. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from anywhere in the world and what time it is there right now. Now, let's begin the story. The first person to share their bread with a stranger rarely realizes they are feeding tomorrow. Rain drifted through the neon lights of Dock 17 like silver threads pulled across the night sky. Cargo shuttles roared overhead every few minutes, their engines shaking puddles beneath rusted loading cranes while merchants hurried to close market stalls before another cold front swept across the frontier station. Thousands of travelers crossed the enormous transit plaza every hour, yet almost none of them looked at the people sitting quietly along the outer wall. Some wrapped themselves in worn blankets. Others stared at the ground with tired eyes, hoping to disappear before another crowd passed. Caleb Brooks adjusted the heavy tool bag resting on his shoulder as he stepped away from the maintenance docks. 12 hours of repairing freight loaders had left grease on his hands and exhaustion in every muscle, but the familiar smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery still made him smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and counted the last few credits he had earned that day. They were enough for one simple loaf and a cup of hot coffee before tomorrow's shift began again. The baker greeted him with a friendly nod, slid a warm loaf across the counter, and wished him a safe evening. Steam escaped through the paper wrapping as Caleb tucked the bread beneath one arm and started toward the narrow apartment district beyond the station. Halfway across the plaza, he slowed without quite understanding why. Near the edge of a broken fountain, almost hidden beneath the flickering blue glow of an old transit sign, sat a woman no one seemed willing to notice. Her clothing was little more than layers of faded fabric worn thin by time and weather. The hood covering her head could not completely hide strands of long silver hair resting against shoulders that looked far too tired to carry another difficult day. Her blue skin had lost much of its natural brightness beneath dust and cold, while her hands remained folded quietly in her lap, as though asking for nothing from anyone. People passed within inches of her without slowing their pace. A businessman looked away before she could accidentally meet his eyes. Two delivery workers changed direction rather than walk beside her. Even the cleaning drones curved politely around the corner where she sat, continuing their programmed routes without interruption. Caleb watched the scene for several silent seconds. He had seen poverty before. Frontier stations always attracted dreamers who arrived with everything and left with almost nothing. Still, something about this woman felt different. She did not beg. She did not call for help. She simply watched the rain falling beyond the station roof with the quiet expression of someone who had grown accustomed to being invisible. Caleb looked down at the warm loaf still wrapped beneath his arm. His stomach reminded him that he had skipped lunch to finish a repair contract before the deadline. It would be his only real meal until morning. He sighed softly, walked toward the woman, and stopped a respectful distance away. She slowly lifted her eyes, revealing deep violet irises that reflected the station lights like distant stars hidden beneath water. Neither of them spoke. Caleb smiled gently before tearing the loaf into two uneven pieces. He held out the larger half without saying a single word. The woman looked first at the bread, then at him, her expression carrying equal parts surprise and disbelief. For a long moment, she did not move. The rain continued tapping against metal rooftops while hurried footsteps echoed across the station. Caleb simply kept his hand extended, patient and unhurried, as though sharing bread with a stranger was the most ordinary thing in the universe. Finally, with hands that trembled ever so slightly, she accepted the warm loaf. Their fingers brushed for only an instant before she lowered her eyes once again. Caleb nodded politely, lifted the smaller piece toward her in a silent gesture that meant enjoy your dinner, then turned and continued walking home through the rain, never noticing that for the first time all evening, the mysterious woman was no longer watching the falling rain. She was watching the human who had walked away without asking a single question. Caleb slept well that night, never imagining he had done anything worth remembering. By sunrise, the rain had disappeared, leaving Dock 17 washed clean beneath a pale golden sky. Freight ships drifted slowly into their assigned berths, while automated cargo cranes stretched across the station like enormous steel birds waking for another day of work. The familiar sounds of hydraulic lifts, warning chimes, and distant engines filled the cool morning air as mechanics, merchants, and transport crews hurried toward another ordinary shift. Caleb arrived 15 minutes early, just as he always did. He believed machines deserved patience because they rarely failed without giving someone a chance to notice first. After checking the maintenance schedule, he climbed onto a disabled loading platform that had refused to lift supply containers since the previous evening. Grease stained his gloves almost immediately, and within an hour he had replaced 2 damaged servo motors and recalibrated the hydraulic pressure by hand. His supervisor watched from nearby before offering an approving nod. "You always fix them faster than expected." Caleb smiled while wiping his hands with an old cloth. "Machines usually tell you what they need if you listen long enough." His supervisor laughed quietly. "I wish people were that easy." Caleb simply shrugged. During his lunch break, he walked toward the small bakery once again. The warm smell of fresh bread drifted into the narrow street long before he reached the entrance. The elderly baker looked up with a friendly smile. "Another loaf today?" Caleb nodded. "Please." As the baker wrapped the bread, she glanced toward the station plaza through the front window. "You shared yesterday." Caleb looked mildly surprised. "You noticed?" Old eyes miss very little. She slid the loaf across the counter before adding gently, "Kindness has a way of returning when nobody expects it." Caleb smiled politely, thanked her, and continued toward the open plaza. The broken fountain still stood beneath the flickering transit sign. The same woman sat quietly beside it, though today the sunlight revealed details the rain had hidden. Her silver hair shimmered faintly beneath the morning light. Her clothing remained worn, but it had been carefully cleaned as well as possible. She sat with remarkable posture despite her difficult circumstances, her hands folded neatly as she watched travelers passing through the station. Once again, almost everyone ignored her. Caleb slowed only briefly before walking toward her. This time he stopped beside the fountain instead of directly in front of her. Without saying anything, he sat on the cool stone edge and broke the loaf into 2 pieces. He placed one half gently beside her before unwrapping the other for himself. They ate in complete silence while hundreds of strangers hurried past without paying either of them much attention. The bread remained warm. The morning breeze carried the comforting scent of roasted coffee from nearby cafes. Somewhere above them, a passenger shuttle departed with a deep, steady hum that vibrated softly through the plaza. After several quiet minutes, the woman turned toward him. Her violet eyes held far less caution than the evening before. She spoke a few soft words in a language Caleb had never heard. His small translator device resting on his belt blinked twice before displaying a simple message. Language not recognized. Caleb looked at the screen, smiled apologetically, and tapped his chest. "Caleb." The woman watched him carefully. Then she rested one hand lightly against herself and spoke a single word. "Soraya." Caleb repeated it carefully. "Soraya." For the first time, the faintest smile touched her face. It was small enough that anyone walking past would have missed it completely. Caleb returned the smile, took another bite of bread, and looked toward the bustling station instead of asking another question. He did not ask where she came from. He did not ask why she was alone. He did not ask how she had arrived at the busiest port in the sector wearing clothes worn thin by hardship. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt respectful. And although neither of them realized it, several people across the plaza had quietly begun watching the unusual sight of a human mechanic sharing an ordinary lunch with the mysterious blue-skinned woman everyone else had chosen not to see. Over the next several days, sharing lunch became an unspoken routine neither Caleb nor Soraya ever discussed. Every afternoon, when the station clocks chimed 12 times across Dock 17, Caleb left the maintenance yard carrying one fresh loaf from the same neighborhood bakery. He never hurried, and he never looked around to see whether anyone was watching. By the time he reached the old fountain, Soraya would already be sitting beneath the faded transit sign with the same quiet posture, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight while endless crowds flowed around her like a river splitting around an unnoticed stone. They always divided the bread the same way. Caleb tore it in half, offered her the larger piece without making a ceremony of it, and sat beside her on the worn stone ledge. Sometimes he brought a cup of warm vegetable soup from the employee cafeteria. Other days he added 2 apples or a small packet of dried fruit, if overtime had earned him a few extra credits. He never acted as though he were giving charity. He simply shared whatever happened to be his lunch that day. Little by little, the silence between them changed. It no longer belonged to strangers. It became the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood that conversation did not always require perfect translation. Caleb pointed toward cargo shuttles climbing into the clouds and spoke simple English words. Ship. Soraya repeated them carefully, her accent soft but determined. He pointed toward the fountain. Water. She smiled faintly. Water. Then she pointed toward a strange flowering vine growing beside the station wall and quietly spoke its name in her own language. Caleb repeated the unfamiliar sounds as best he could, making her laugh for the first time. The laughter surprised both of them. It was light, genuine, and brief, disappearing almost as quickly as it had arrived, yet it somehow made the noisy station seem warmer. Nearby merchants gradually began noticing the unusual pair. A fruit vendor quietly slipped an extra orange into Caleb's shopping bag without charging him. The elderly baker wrapped 1 additional dinner roll inside the paper sack each afternoon before pretending it had been there all along. Even children crossing the plaza with their parents occasionally smiled at Soraya instead of avoiding her. Small acts of kindness seemed to multiply without anyone announcing them. Not everyone approved. One afternoon, 2 freight workers paused near the fountain before one of them muttered just loudly enough to be heard. You do not even know who she is. Caleb calmly finished chewing a piece of bread before answering. No. The worker folded his arms. She could be anyone. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. That is true. Does that not bother you? Caleb looked toward Soraya, who quietly lowered her eyes as though expecting him to stand and leave. Instead, he smiled gently before replying. Everyone is someone before I know their name. The 2 workers exchanged uncertain glances before walking away without another word. Soraya remained perfectly still for several long seconds. Finally, she turned toward Caleb, her violet eyes reflecting something deeper than gratitude. She touched one hand lightly against her chest before softly speaking a sentence he could not understand. His translator blinked helplessly once again. Caleb laughed quietly and tapped the small device with one finger. One of these days you are going to teach this thing a new language. She smiled, then reached into the pocket of her worn cloak. Slowly she removed a tiny blue crystal no larger than a coin. It caught the afternoon sunlight, scattering delicate patterns across the stone fountain like fragments of a clear summer sky. She carefully placed it into Caleb's hand before closing his fingers around it with unexpected gentleness. No explanation followed. None seemed necessary. Caleb slipped the crystal into his jacket pocket with quiet appreciation, never realizing that several people watching from across the plaza recognized the symbol immediately. Their expressions changed from curiosity to astonishment, but before anyone could approach, Soraya simply returned to sharing the last pieces of warm bread beside the fountain, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Ignoring someone became more difficult once people had seen another person stop. During the following week, Dock 17 continued its restless rhythm of arriving freighters, humming cargo cranes, and travelers chasing distant destinations. Yet something subtle had begun to change around the old fountain. The elderly baker now placed an extra roll into Caleb's paper bag every afternoon without mentioning it. A fruit merchant occasionally left 2 fresh pears on the edge of the fountain before quietly returning to his stall. Even the maintenance crew, men and women who normally hurried through lunch in less than 15 minutes, started slowing their pace as they passed the familiar corner where Caleb and Soraya shared their simple meals. None of them sat down. Not yet. But fewer people looked away. Caleb noticed the change without thinking much about it. To him, the station simply felt a little friendlier than it had before. One afternoon, after replacing a damaged power converter beneath landing platform 9, he walked toward the fountain carrying warm tomato soup inside 2 insulated cups instead of bread alone. The autumn air carried a crisp chill through the station, making the rising steam especially comforting. Soraya was already waiting beneath the old transit sign, though today she stood instead of sitting. She watched a flock of tiny maintenance drones crossing the open plaza in perfect formation, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. When Caleb approached, she greeted him with a small smile that reached her eyes before accepting one of the cups with both hands. He pointed carefully. Soup. She repeated the unfamiliar word with quiet concentration. Soup. Caleb grinned. Perfect. They sat together beside the fountain while warm steam drifted into the cool air. Soraya tasted the soup slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment as though savoring not only the flavor but also the comfort of holding something warm. After several minutes, she looked toward Caleb and spoke another sentence in her own language. The translator clipped to his belt emitted a soft tone before displaying the same familiar message. Language not recognized. Caleb laughed under his breath. You are determined to make this thing feel useless. Soraya tilted her head with playful curiosity before gently pointing toward the small blue crystal she had given him the previous day, now hanging from a simple cord around his neck beneath his work jacket. Caleb touched it instinctively. I thought it looked too nice to leave in a toolbox. Her expression softened immediately. She placed one hand lightly over her heart before giving the smallest respectful nod. The gesture carried obvious meaning even if no words could explain it. At that moment, an elderly alien vendor approached the fountain carrying a basket filled with woven cloth. He stopped several feet away, looked first at Soraya, then at the crystal resting against Caleb's chest. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he bowed his head with remarkable respect. He said nothing. He simply continued walking after a quiet pause. Caleb watched him disappear into the crowd. Friendly place, he said with a smile. Soraya lowered her eyes, hiding an emotion that seemed unexpectedly complicated. Later that afternoon, while Caleb returned to work, the elderly vendor quietly entered a nearby tea shop where several longtime station residents gathered every evening. He spoke in little more than a whisper, yet every person at the table gradually fell silent. One by one, they turned toward the plaza visible through the wide front window. Outside, the human mechanic laughed as Soraya attempted another English word while holding a warm cup of soup between her hands. No one inside the tea shop interrupted them. Instead, they watched with growing astonishment, because every one of them recognized the ancient blue crystal hanging around Caleb's neck. It was not valuable because of what it was made from. It was valuable because of who was permitted to carry it. Caleb remained completely unaware. As the afternoon sunlight faded across Dock 17, he simply finished his soup beside the mysterious woman, enjoying another ordinary meal while an extraordinary secret quietly spread through the station faster than either of them could possibly imagine. The whispers spreading across Dock 17 reached farther than Caleb ever imagined, but they never reached him. His days continued with the same dependable rhythm they always had. He repaired freight elevators before sunrise, replaced damaged guidance sensors after lunch, and finished each evening beside the old fountain with fresh bread or warm soup waiting to be shared. To him, nothing important had changed except that Soraya smiled more often. The guarded uncertainty that had shadowed her during those first rainy evenings slowly disappeared. She no longer sat with her shoulders drawn inward as though expecting another day of disappointment. Instead, she watched the station with quiet curiosity, occasionally pointing toward unusual spacecraft or colorful market displays, while Caleb explained their purpose using simple words and patient gestures. Their conversations remained wonderfully imperfect. His translator still refused to recognize her language, forcing both of them to communicate through expressions, laughter, and small demonstrations instead of long explanations. Somehow, they understood each other anyway. One cool afternoon, while autumn winds carried golden leaves through the open transit plaza, Caleb arrived carrying 2 bowls of vegetable stew prepared by the elderly baker herself. She insisted, he explained with a grin while handing one bowl to Soraya. Apparently, she believes nobody should face cold weather without hot food. Soraya accepted the bowl with grateful eyes before placing one hand gently over her heart. She spoke several soft words in her own language, then pointed toward the bakery across the plaza. Caleb smiled. I will tell her you appreciated it. Before either of them could begin eating, the elderly baker herself appeared carrying a neatly folded wool blanket across her arms. She approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away before offering the blanket toward Soraya without saying a word. Soraya looked genuinely surprised. After a brief hesitation, she accepted the gift with both hands and bowed her head deeply. The baker returned the gesture with a warm smile. "Everyone deserves to stay warm," she said softly before quietly returning to her shop. Caleb watched her leave with quiet admiration. "She is a good person." Soraya looked from the blanket to Caleb before gently nodding. Around them, several merchants who had once ignored the lonely corner now greeted Soraya with polite smiles as they opened their stalls each morning. A child even waved enthusiastically while passing with his father, earning a shy wave in return. Compassion, Caleb realized, had a curious way of becoming contagious. Later that evening, after finishing their meal, Soraya stood and carefully folded the new blanket before draping it across the stone edge of the fountain. She then reached into the pocket of her weathered cloak and removed a tiny silver pendant unlike anything Caleb had seen before. The delicate symbol resembled a circle surrounded by 7 small stars, crafted with extraordinary detail despite its modest size. She placed it beside the empty soup bowl, looked directly into Caleb's eyes, and gently pushed it toward him. Caleb immediately shook his head with an embarrassed smile. "You do not have to give me anything." Soraya quietly nudged it closer again. Her expression carried calm determination mixed with unmistakable gratitude. Caleb hesitated before carefully picking up the pendant. It felt surprisingly warm despite the cool evening air. "Thank you," he said sincerely, slipping it into his jacket pocket beside the blue crystal. Soraya smiled with quiet relief, as though something important had finally been accepted. Neither of them noticed the elderly alien vendor watching from across the plaza. The moment he saw the silver pendant resting in Caleb's hand, he froze completely. His basket slipped slightly against his arm before he quickly recovered it. Without another glance, he hurried away through the evening crowd faster than anyone had ever seen him move. Caleb simply gathered the empty bowls and stood with an easy smile. "Same time tomorrow?" Soraya answered not with words, but with the brightest smile he had seen since the day they met. As freight ships glided silently overhead beneath a sky painted with fading orange light, the two quietly walked in opposite directions, never realizing that somewhere beyond the frontier station, people had already begun searching for the owner of a silver pendant that no ordinary traveler was ever meant to possess. Ignorance can feel peaceful until the truth decides it has waited long enough. 3 days passed after Soraya gave Caleb the silver pendant, and life at Dock 17 continued beneath clear autumn skies and the steady rhythm of arriving freighters. Caleb spent his mornings replacing worn electrical relays inside cargo elevators, and his afternoons repairing docking clamps exposed to years of freezing temperatures and salt carried by the station winds. Whenever his shift ended, he followed the same familiar path toward the old fountain with fresh bread tucked beneath one arm. The routine had become so natural that even the workers finishing beside him would smile and wave as he left. "Tell your friend the bakery made cinnamon rolls today," one mechanic joked. Caleb laughed. "If there are any left by the time I get there." When he reached the plaza, however, something immediately felt different. The fountain remained exactly where it had always stood. The faded transit sign still flickered overhead. The bakery still filled the air with the comforting smell of fresh bread. But Soraya was standing instead of sitting. Her posture had changed. She no longer looked like someone quietly waiting for another ordinary afternoon. She watched the entrance to the station with calm attention, as though listening for footsteps nobody else could hear. Caleb approached with an easy smile and held up the warm paper bag. "The baker spoiled us again." Soraya smiled in return, though the expression carried a trace of sadness that had not been there before. They sat together beside the fountain and quietly shared bread while the busy station continued moving around them. For several minutes neither spoke. Then Soraya slowly reached into her cloak and removed a small object wrapped inside faded blue cloth. She unfolded it carefully, revealing an old metallic compass unlike any navigation device Caleb had ever seen. Tiny symbols circled its polished surface, glowing faintly whenever sunlight touched the engraved lines. She placed it gently into Caleb's hands. He examined it with genuine curiosity before looking back at her. "Another gift?" She nodded once. Caleb smiled awkwardly. You really do not have to keep giving me things. She gently closed his fingers around the compass anyway before resting her hand over his for only a brief moment. The gesture felt less like generosity and more like trust. Caleb slipped the compass beside the crystal and pendant already resting safely inside his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I will take good care of it." Across the plaza, the elderly alien vendor noticed the exchange. His face immediately lost all color. He quietly lowered the basket he had been carrying and stared toward the old fountain with unmistakable disbelief. Within seconds, he disappeared into the nearest communications office without speaking to anyone. Less than an hour later, unusual activity began spreading throughout Dock 17. Station security officers quietly checked arrival schedules twice instead of once. Harbor controllers received unexpected priority transmissions from deep space. Long-range sensors detected multiple unidentified vessels approaching the frontier sector, though none followed commercial shipping routes. Rumors drifted through cafes and maintenance shops before sunset. Some believed an important diplomatic delegation was arriving. Others whispered about a missing explorer finally being found. Caleb heard the conversations while tightening the final bolts on a cargo lift, but paid them little attention. Frontier stations attracted unexpected visitors every week. As evening settled over the docks, golden light faded into deep blue shadows across the plaza. Caleb and Soraya finished the last pieces of bread together before standing. He brushed a few crumbs from his jacket and smiled. "See you tomorrow." Soraya looked at him for a long silent moment. Then, instead of simply nodding as she usually did, she stepped forward and gently placed one hand over her heart before lowering her head with quiet respect. It was the same graceful gesture she had used whenever she offered something deeply meaningful. Caleb smiled warmly, returned the gesture as best he could, and walked toward his apartment without another thought. Behind him, Soraya remained beside the fountain watching until he disappeared into the evening crowd. Far beyond the station, hidden among the stars, dozens of elegant starships silently altered their course toward Dock 17, following a signal that had finally been answered. Morning arrived beneath an unusually quiet sky. Caleb noticed the silence before he even reached Dock 17. Normally, the station awakened with the familiar chorus of cargo engines, docking alarms, and cheerful merchants preparing another busy day. Today, those sounds were softer, interrupted by long pauses as people glanced toward the enormous observation windows overlooking space. Maintenance crews whispered while pretending to inspect equipment. Harbor controllers repeatedly checked their displays with puzzled expressions. Even the cafe televisions abandoned weather reports in favor of live images from the station's orbital sensors. Caleb followed everyone's gaze and saw dozens of brilliant points of light slowly appearing against the darkness beyond the planet. At first, they resembled distant stars. Then the stars began moving together. Within minutes, every screen across the station displayed the same message. Unidentified diplomatic fleet approaching. Maintain normal operations. Caleb read the announcement once before returning to the freight elevator waiting for repair. His supervisor chuckled while tightening a loose panel beside him. "You really are impossible." Caleb looked up. "Why?" "Half the station is staring out the windows." Caleb smiled. "The elevator is still broken." They finished replacing the final actuator just before lunch. As always, Caleb visited the bakery before walking toward the old fountain. The elderly baker handed him 2 warm loaves instead of one. "Business has been strange all morning," she admitted quietly. "Take the extra loaf." Caleb laughed. "I cannot pay for 2. She gently folded his fingers around the paper bag. "You already have." Before he could protest, she disappeared into the kitchen. Caleb shook his head with an amused smile and continued across the plaza. Soraya was waiting beside the fountain, though today she wore the new wool blanket folded neatly across her shoulders. The afternoon sunlight reflected softly through her silver hair while she watched the crowded station with calm, thoughtful eyes. Caleb held up the paper bag. "Apparently kindness earns free bread now." She smiled warmly, clearly understanding more from his expression than his words. They sat together as they always did, dividing the fresh loaves into equal pieces. Around them, however, the station no longer behaved normally. More travelers stopped walking. Merchants quietly stepped outside their shops. Children pointed excitedly toward the enormous observation dome above the central plaza. A deep, harmonious tone echoed throughout Dock 17 as incoming vessels requested landing clearance. Caleb glanced upward. Through the transparent ceiling, he could now see elegant silver starships descending through the atmosphere in perfect formation. Their polished hulls reflected sunlight like floating mirrors, each vessel moving with remarkable precision. They looked nothing like commercial freighters or military cruisers. They seemed almost ceremonial. Nearby conversations grew louder. That crest belongs to the High Stellar Council. Why would they come here? Someone important must be arriving. Caleb broke another piece of bread and handed it to Soraya before taking a bite himself. Looks like we picked an interesting lunch break. She accepted the bread but did not eat immediately. Instead, she quietly watched the descending ships with an expression that blended relief, gratitude, and quiet sadness. Moments later, the first shuttle touched down on the primary landing platform. Its ramp lowered slowly as dozens of elegantly dressed officials emerged in flawless formation. They did not rush. They did not spread through the station. They simply stood together, scanning the crowded plaza with calm determination. An unusual silence settled across Dock 17. Even the cargo cranes seemed to pause between movements. Caleb noticed the change, but remained seated beside the fountain. "Something important is happening," he said gently. Soraya finally turned toward him. Her violet eyes lingered on his face as though memorizing every detail. Then she offered the same graceful gesture she had shared the evening before, one hand resting over her heart while she lowered her head with quiet respect. Before Caleb could respond, every official stepping from the silver shuttle saw her at exactly the same moment. Without a single spoken command, they all stopped walking. The officials remained perfectly still for only a heartbeat before every one of them lowered to one knee at exactly the same moment. The synchronized movement spread across the landing platform like a silent wave, elegant uniforms touching the polished ground beneath the afternoon sun. Conversations throughout Dock 17 vanished instantly. Merchants froze behind their counters. Cargo crews stopped operating heavy machinery. Even children who had been pointing excitedly toward the arriving ships quietly lowered their hands. Caleb looked from the kneeling delegation to Soraya with open confusion. "Do they know you?" he asked gently. Soraya did not answer immediately. She slowly stood from the edge of the fountain, carefully folded the wool blanket the elderly baker had given her, and placed it upon the stone ledge with remarkable care, as though she wanted to leave nothing behind in disorder. The lead official, an elderly alien wearing a silver ceremonial cloak embroidered with 7 radiant stars, rose slowly before approaching her. When he stopped several feet away, he bowed so deeply that his forehead nearly touched his clasped hands. He spoke several respectful sentences in the same beautiful language Caleb's translator had never managed to recognize. This time, however, the small device clipped to Caleb's belt suddenly emitted a clear tone. "Software update received. Translation available." The mechanical voice quietly translated the official's words. "Your Majesty, the search has ended. The Council has waited for your return." Caleb blinked in surprise. He looked toward Soraya, then back at the translator, convinced it had misunderstood. The device repeated the sentence exactly. "Your Majesty, the search has ended." Soraya closed her eyes briefly before answering in a calm voice. "Thank you for coming." The translator now converted every word with perfect clarity. She turned toward Caleb, who still held half a loaf of bread in one hand. His expression carried no fear, only quiet disbelief. "Your Majesty," he repeated softly. Soraya offered him the same gentle smile she had shared beside the fountain every afternoon. "I wished you could know me as Soraya before you knew the title." Caleb looked down at the bread, then back at her, and laughed quietly in astonishment. "Well, that certainly explains why everyone suddenly looks nervous." Several nearby officials exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected shock, demands for explanations, perhaps embarrassment over unknowingly sharing meals with one of the most respected leaders among their worlds. Instead, the human simply smiled exactly as he always had. The elderly official finally turned toward Caleb. His eyes rested upon the blue crystal hanging from Caleb's neck, the silver pendant tucked inside his jacket pocket, and the ancient compass still resting in his tool bag. His expression softened with profound respect. "Human, he said carefully through his translator. Those gifts are carried only by someone trusted beyond rank. Caleb instinctively touched the crystal beneath his jacket. She gave them to me. She has never given them to anyone else. Around the crowded plaza, whispers spread like gentle wind through autumn leaves. The elderly baker quietly covered her mouth with one hand. The fruit merchant smiled to himself. The maintenance workers who had watched Caleb leave every afternoon slowly began understanding why kindness had seemed to gather around the old fountain long before anyone knew the truth. Soraya stepped closer to Caleb and looked at the half-loaf still resting in his hand. Every person who searched for me believed they would prove their loyalty through power, wealth, or authority, she said softly. You offered bread before you asked my name. Caleb shrugged with an easy smile that had never changed. You looked hungry. A warm silence settled across Dock 17. Then, before ambassadors, officials, merchants, mechanics, and travelers from countless worlds, Soraya accepted the remaining piece of bread from Caleb's hand exactly as she had on that rainy evening weeks before. She broke it in half once again and returned one piece to him. Together they shared the simple meal while an entire diplomatic delegation waited patiently nearby. And everyone watching understood that the greatest moment they had witnessed that day had not begun when the fleet arrived. It had begun long before, with one ordinary human who had quietly decided that a stranger deserved kindness before explanation. The morning after the delegation arrived, Dock 17 looked familiar again, yet everyone who walked through the plaza knew it would never truly be the same. Cargo shuttles continued lifting into the bright blue sky. Maintenance crews climbed ladders with tool belts hanging from their shoulders. Merchants opened colorful storefronts while the comforting smell of fresh bread drifted once more from the neighborhood bakery. Life had returned to its ordinary rhythm, but ordinary itself now carried a different meaning. The old fountain remained exactly where it had always stood, and beside it the worn stone ledge still held faint crumbs from yesterday's shared meal. Caleb arrived for work carrying his toolbox as though nothing remarkable had happened. His supervisor shook his head with a smile. You disappear for lunch with a stranger, and somehow the entire station ends up welcoming a diplomatic fleet. Caleb laughed quietly. I was just eating bread. Apparently history was eating with you. The comment followed Caleb through the rest of the morning. Mechanics greeted him more warmly than before. Merchants waved as he crossed the plaza. Even travelers passing through the station seemed to recognize him, though he remained politely puzzled by the attention. To Caleb, he had simply treated another person with basic decency. During lunch, he instinctively stopped by the bakery, only to discover the elderly baker already waiting with a freshly wrapped loaf resting on the counter. When Caleb reached for his wallet, she gently pushed his hand away. Not today. Caleb smiled awkwardly. You have already given me too much. She shook her head. No, we all watched you give first. Before he could answer, a quiet voice spoke behind him. May I still share it? Caleb turned and found Soraya standing in the doorway. She no longer wore worn traveling clothes. Elegant sapphire robes embroidered with delicate silver patterns rested gracefully across her shoulders, yet her familiar gentle smile remained exactly the same. Several members of the diplomatic delegation waited respectfully outside instead of following her inside. Caleb looked at the fresh loaf, then at her, and smiled. Only if we split it the usual way. Together they walked back to the old fountain while the station quietly watched. Soraya accepted half the loaf exactly as she had on the very first rainy evening. She took a small bite before looking around the bustling plaza. This place gave me shelter when I had none. Her eyes settled on the bakery, the fruit stand, the mechanics, and finally Caleb. But you gave me something greater. You allowed me to be only a person before I had to become a symbol again. Caleb considered those words while breaking another piece of bread. I still think of you as Soraya. Her smile became brighter than the morning sunlight reflecting across the station windows. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. She reached into a small ceremonial satchel and carefully removed the blue crystal, the silver pendant, and the ancient compass. Instead of taking them back, she gently adjusted the cord around Caleb's neck so the crystal rested comfortably against his chest. Keep them, she said softly. Not because of who I am, but because of who you were before you knew. Nearby, the elderly official stepped forward and addressed the gathering crowd. Let this station be remembered as the place where compassion was offered without calculation and kindness arrived before titles. Quiet applause spread naturally through the plaza, beginning with the bakery, continuing through the market stalls, and finally reaching the maintenance crews who had watched Caleb leave with bread every afternoon. No parade followed. No grand ceremony replaced the simple moment. Instead, merchants invited strangers to share tables during lunch. Mechanics carried extra coffee for co-workers working late shifts. Travelers paused to greet people they might once have ignored. The kindness that had begun beside one forgotten fountain quietly became part of everyday life. As the diplomatic ships prepared to depart later that afternoon, Soraya looked back one final time through the shuttle doorway. Caleb stood beside the old fountain holding half a loaf of bread, smiling exactly as he had on the day they first met. She returned the smile before the shuttle doors closed. Years later, visitors would ask why a simple stone bench beside an aging fountain had been preserved while so much of Dock 17 had been modernized. The answer was always the same. Great civilizations remembered battles, treaties, and rulers, but the people of Dock 17 chose to remember the place where one ordinary human proved that the value of a stranger should never be measured after learning their name, because the truest kindness is the kindness offered before the truth is ever known.